The Polygamous Sex, A Man's Right to the Other Woman, by Ester Vilar. Narrated by El Zorro Plateador. Foreword. Polygamy, incest, daddy issues, DILFs. What is going on in this book? Whoa. Okay, first a bit of background. This is the second of 3 books by Ester Vilar on gender issues. The first is The Manipulated Man, and the second, this one, The Polygamous Sex, A Man's Right to the Other Woman, is the second. And the third is called The End of Manipulation, which is untranslated from its original German and remains unknown to the English-speaking world. Her first book of this series, The Manipulated Man, which I found deeply troubling and highly accurate, is simpler compared to this one. To digest the contents of The Polygamous Sex as a reader, you must be much more emotionally and conceptually prepared. And I advise you read or listen to the first book before you dive into this one, which I have recorded for your listening pleasure, so look for The Manipulated Man on this YouTube channel. This volume, The Polygamous Sex, is much different than The Manipulated Man, but it may be more important in terms of its meaning to and impact upon you as a man. This book is essentially Villar's treatise on sexual dynamics, on sexual fidelity and infidelity, on the power dynamics around sexuality, and it is much more complex and troubling than The Manipulated Man. There are 3 reasons why this book is much more confusing and difficult than The Manipulated Man. First, Villar creates her own vocabulary and uses common words in new ways, so decoding her points at first is not simple. Second, the content is much more philosophical and conceptual. This contrasts The Manipulated Man, which is concrete and based on social patterns you can see every day, even though these books are nearly 50 years old. And finally, the structure and content of each chapter builds upon the last in a successive and ordered way. The first 2 chapters cover theoretical concepts. You don't feel nearly as grounded as you might have when reading The Manipulated Man, which gets right into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about these 3 difficulties a little more. The first difficulty is the different terms that Villar uses. She uses several terms and key words that are important to understand from the outset, ones that she uses in an unusual way or that may have translated oddly from German into English. The term protege, for example, usually means an apprentice, someone who is guided or nurtured. But for Villar, it simply means a woman, but as seen from a man's perspective. A weaker, subordinate person, a person to take care of, a dependent, a wife, a simulated child. The term adopt is another one, which extends this protege metaphor and means to Villar when a man marries a woman, he adopts her. Therefore, an adoptee is a man's wife. The term incest extends this metaphor even further because she doesn't mean the literal definition referring to a parent having sex with a biological child, but instead to a husband having sex with his protege, his wife. This is what I mean when I say Villar uses common terms in new ways. The second difficulty is her writing is at times opaque and difficult. This book is much more philosophical, theoretical, and cerebral than The Manipulated Man, and so it's less immediately practical. It takes a while for Villar to get up to speed, but the payoff is better. Another hurdle is how the sentence structures she writes in are often long and complex, which makes for difficult reading and listening. You have to be able to hold in your head quite a bit of new and strange conceptual imagery to understand her. This means you may need to reread or re-listen to some of these sections. The third difficulty is the book's structure. It has 6 chapters, and her content moves in a specific order, each building upon the last in a succession. The trouble you'll hit is the first 2 chapters, which are about love as a philosophical idea and power as a state of control, which are both harder and thicker than the remaining 4 chapters, so Villar's work does get increasingly easier. In the final 3 chapters, Villar applies the concepts she creates and really builds a powerful momentum. In chapter 1, called Are There Two Kinds of Love Between a Man and a Woman?, she begins with a brief movie scene displaying her version of a father's love for his protege, and then gets right into dealing with one of philosophy's most loathed topics, love. And she notes how men and women define love differently. What could be more fleeting and difficult to define than that? But she goes for it and does so in a way that she reuses later on in the book. In chapter 2, called Love and Power, she breaks up human power into 3 groups: the male power block, the female power block, and children's power block, each having different profiles of leverage over the others. She covers how men are functionally powerless because they occupy a paternal role both to children and to women, and so are easily exploited. The female power block, I notice, might equate to today's female imperative in the parlance of today's manosphere. She mentions the Greek play Lysistrata, where a woman tired of men waging too much war organizes women to blackmail men into peace by withholding sex, which Villar adds is an easy exertion for women anyway. In chapter 3, called The Father Syndrome, Villar gets right into it, observing how men seek to satisfy 2 instinctual drives, the need to protect and the need for sex, and how these drives are in fundamental opposition and end up placing men in enormous tension because a man cannot have sex with a woman under his protection without feeling that he is violating her, in a quasi-incestuous relationship. I am a father myself, and I found this aspect of the book troubling because Villar bandies about with the taboo of incest the way a cat plays with a mouse. Here she mentions proteges and intimates how marital sex is akin to pedophilia. Because men have a strong nurturing instinct, and men marry helpless and childlike women, Villar views sex among married couples as being a kind of incest. The more dependent a woman is upon her husband, the more their sexual activities feel like incest. The more she positions herself as in need of protection, the more she becomes his protege, and the less she becomes his equal, his lover, thus neutralizing his sexual instinct and need for physical contact with a lusty, passionate adult woman. Villar then illustrates how a man is forced into polygamy because he cannot satisfy his sexual needs with the same woman with which he satisfies his protective needs. And then Villar divides up polygamy into 4 levels, ordered by how much money each level requires. Simultaneous polygamy for the rich men, pimps, and players. Successive polygamy for the middle-class men with some money to burn. Sporadic polygamy for the working-class men with very little extra money. And finally, symbolic polygamy for the poor, by which she means free or inexpensive pornography used by men as a substitute for physical contact with women. In the chapter Love Between a Man and Woman is Monogamous, Jealous, and Faithful, she reveals more about her metaphor for the father and protege relationship, how women assume the role of protege to become dependents, which she calls pseudo-children. Villar's stance is that this is deeply toxic to male sexuality because he cannot have sex with children without serious mental breakdowns. However, today, the pickup artist community espouses that a player assumes the emotional stance of amused mastery toward ladies, thus treating all women like little girls. Villar talks about how love between a man and a woman is affected by changes in both intelligence, which can go up or down, and in the sexualized gender of either person, whether highly feminized or highly masculinized, which she refers to as sexual polarity, which also can go up or down. Any changes, she says, in intelligence or this sexual polarity within a couple affect how long the love will last, and she breaks apart relationships by time: brief loves, middle-length loves, and great loves. The 5th chapter, Public Fathers, Public Children, is wild. She articulates the propaganda machine built to perpetuate the myth of female subjugation. She immediately establishes how the concept of the patriarchy is an elaborate lie perpetuated to conceal the fundamental power of the matriarchy in society, and that a breed of men called public fathers perpetuates this myth. This chapter is immediately applicable to technology today, to social media, and to how large social media platforms are curtailing, censoring, and silencing many voices attacking feminism, the matriarchy, and the feminine imperative. Villar then breaks men into 3 groups. The first, involuntary public fathers, are those men working in mass media who feel compelled to build upon and continue the myth of the patriarchy, as any other message threatens the hidden power of the matriarchy. The second, voluntary public fathers, are those men who are under-masculinized and must overcompensate for it. In doing so, they overdo the masculinization of their dress and behavior and help fabricate the false myth of feminine inferiority. Oh, we recognize these types today. Hipsters. These weaker males are in on the con job, affecting the rest of men. These voluntary public fathers volunteer for the job of perpetuating the myth of the big bad patriarchy. The third and last type of public father is the true believer, those men who really believe in the oppression of women. These white knights are truly beyond rational thinking because they cannot see what is right in front of them. That men are exploited in favor of women in a systemic and comprehensive machine. The last group Villar identifies is public children, women, the beneficiaries of this public lie. These public children create what Villar calls dead lizards, by which she means the topic of propaganda, something to present as evidence of men's oppression of women. In the final chapter, Man as the Victim of His Polygamy, Villar makes her ultimate checkmate when she writes, quote, "A woman who regards her husband as her father cannot be the victim of sexual infidelity," unquote. When discussing prostitutes and their victimization, Villar attacks not the men, but the corrupt housewives who compel their men to become Johns outside the marital bedroom. Quote, "The women who sell themselves are not the victims of the men who seek them out, but rather of the venality of the so-called decent women which drives these men into their arms," unquote. She adds, quote, "As long as women insist on simulating children, as long as they want protection, whether they need it or not, men have a right to more than one woman at a time," unquote. Okay, so much to unpack with this. Let's take another minute to cover a few more points about this book. Villar does not see women as weaker than men, and this is part of what makes her critique so devastating. She says that women choose the victim state, that they choose to be weaker and dumber because it is strategically advantageous. Because they are physically weaker and smaller, but control sex with an iron fist, Villar sees women, as a whole, as tricky, wily, and able to thoroughly manipulate men. Even when women have sex with alpha males, the fantasy is that he will adopt her and that she will become his protege and be the one to tame this wild beast into becoming her provider and father. She believes women's sexuality is not repressed by men. She believes that women hide their own sexual power to snare men via their paternal desires by playing the role of a poor innocent creature in need of his protection. Villar sees the metaphor of the patriarchy as something that men created for women to control men. She believes that the system we're in now is one that women could drop any time that they are done relying on men to take care of them. And as I write this introduction, this is coming to pass. The patriarchy as such is being decommissioned. The war on the patriarchy is occurring now. Feminism has known of this book for 50 years, yet it has made no response to it. I could find few references or critiques about this book online. Why? It could be that Villar is so blatantly wrong that she doesn't warrant critical inspection or response. But she could also be so right that it terrifies the matriarchy. Because, according to the Book of Puck and the many works of the Grand Master Rollo Tomassi, the language of women, womanese, means that the medium is the message. Why would feminism bother to respond to Villar when it knows she might be right, or at least substantially right? Villar's work is so difficult because, even though she gets many things wrong or is simply off, she gets so much right. Another reason for feminism's silence about Villar is how her bold generalizations, shocking really, make it so easy to dismiss her ideas. She is ruthless about women being tricky and deceptive and makes men out to be honorable and noble. As you listen, consider the prominent way we think about sexual dynamics today, about couples, about marriage, about the way pickup artists think about this, about game, about alpha males and the many beta males, and the strict ranking system of the sexual market value that everyone finds themselves placed upon by everyone else. And think about what Villar says here. She means that men look for intellectual equals who are sexually their opposites to have a sexual relationship with, but usually find only pseudo-children. Lately, there has been a surge in women's preference for pornography involving daddy issues, powerful dark father figures, such as in 50 Shades of Grey, the phenomenon of the DILF, the dad I like to And Villar offers us some deep insight into these daddy issues, perhaps more so than any other work out there. She does this by sidestepping Freud and the other early 20th century psychologists and grants us new ways to see masculinity within her framework of power and sexuality and her custom-built vocabulary. After reading The Polygamous Sex, you will never look at middle-aged men in the same way. Ester Vilar executes some interesting philosophical moves in this book, troubling, oh yes, but also fascinating. I encourage you to think about the current state of the gender wars happening right now, about abortion rights issues, about the current state of marriage as an institution, and of families within Villar's framework, and apply them to the sexual realities, frustrations, and politics of today's man and woman. El Zorro Plateador, May 2019.